In December 1941, the war that had already swallowed Europe and China arrived on the tropical shores of the Philippine Islands. The Japanese Empire struck within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, raining bombs on Clark Field and Nichols Field, destroying American air power before it ever left the ground. By nightfall, columns of enemy troops were landing on the beaches of Luzon. For the soldiers of the United States Army forces in the Far East, Americans and Filipinos alike, the calm world of garrison duty vanished in smoke and fire. What followed would become one of the most tragic and defining episodes of the Pacific War, the fall of Bataan. The Philippines had long been considered the shield of America in Asia. General Douglas MacArthur, a man of immense confidence and theatrical bearing, commanded the defense. He believed that with discipline and fortitude, his mixed army could hold the islands until reinforcements came across the Pacific. But the Pacific after December 7th was a sea of flames. The American fleet lay crippled, and Japan's war machine moved like a storm through Southeast Asia. No help would come. Still, on the slopes and jungles of Bataan, men prepared to fight. They were farmers, clerks, teachers, and mechanics wearing uniforms that smelled of mothballs and fear. Filipino scouts marched beside American regulars, their accents mingling in the humid air. They carried old Springfields, Enfields, and a handful of Browning machine guns. Behind them stretched miles of jungle green, wet and unforgiving. It was not a battlefield, it was a trap of vines and fever. When the first Japanese shells fell on December 23, 1941, the ground shook like a living thing. Artillery thunder echoed off the limestone hills, and the forests caught fire. Soldiers dug shallow foxholes in the mud, clutching rifles slick with sweat. Above them, the sky was filled with enemy planes, black dots circling like hawks. The defenders were outmatched in every sense. Fewer guns, fewer planes, and almost no medical supplies. Yet in the early weeks, they fought with a determination that astonished even their commanders. By January 1942, the retreat into the Bataan Peninsula was complete. 80,000 men, 65,000 Filipinos and 15,000 Americans were squeezed into a narrow tongue of land jutting into Manila Bay. Behind them, the fortress island of Corregidor bristled with big guns. Ahead of them lay the advancing Japanese 14th Army. What had been planned as a brief delaying action became a siege. The men of Bataan were ordered to hold, and hold they did. The peninsula became a world apart, cut off from the rest of the war. The air was thick with humidity, the ground alive with insects. Supplies that had been meant for 6 months were gone in one. Each day the ration grew smaller, a handful of rice, a spoonful of tinned meat, sometimes a slice of carabao if a starving animal wandered too close. Diseases moved faster than bullets. Malaria left men shivering under tropical suns. Dysentery kept them doubled in pain. The smell of sickness clung to everything. At night, the jungle came alive with sound. Cicadas screamed, mosquitoes droned. Far away, the flash of artillery lit the clouds red. In those brief quiet hours, men spoke softly about home, about Chicago streets, Ilocano villages, Kansas fields. Some carved names into the butts of their rifles, others whispered prayers. They were young, most barely 20. They had been told they were the shield of democracy, and so they fought even as their bodies failed them. On the Japanese side, the commanders were astonished by the resistance. They had expected the Americans to collapse within weeks. Instead, every ridge and ravine became a fortress. The fighting around Mount Samat and Abucay line was savage. Machine guns rattled through the palms, mortars tore trees into splinters. Both armies bled into the same soil. For the Japanese, victory was a matter of honor. For the defenders, it was survival. By March 1942, the front lines had dissolved into chaos. There was no distinction between combat and starvation. Hospitals overflowed with men who weighed less than 100 pounds. Quinine was gone, morphine diluted with water. Nurses worked until they collapsed. They used torn shirts as bandages, coconut oil for antiseptic. Still, they worked because doing nothing would have meant admitting defeat. On April 3rd, the Japanese launched their final offensive. Artillery from Mount Samat poured shells onto the battered lines below. Flames rolled across the jungles. When the smoke cleared, the road to Mariveles lay open. General Edward King Jr., commanding the battered Datu Corps, understood that resistance was now suicide. He had received no word from MacArthur, who had already escaped to Australia, but he knew the truth. To continue fighting would mean annihilation. On the morning of April 9, 1942, King made his decision. He ordered white flags raised along the front. Some officers refused at first, tears streaming down their faces, but the men had no ammunition left, no food, no strength. They were dying standing up. King walked out to meet the Japanese under a white handkerchief tied to a stick. He was the first American general in history to surrender a field army. When word spread, silence fell across the peninsula. For 99 days they had fought alone, believing that help was coming. Now there was nothing left to believe in. Men stacked their rifles carefully, as if laying friends to rest. Some wept, others stared blankly into the trees. They had given everything. The Japanese victory was overwhelming, but also disastrous. General Homer had expected 25,000 prisoners. He received more than 76,000. There was no plan to feed them, no transport, no mercy. The captives would be forced to march 65 miles north to Camp O'Donnell. It was called transfer. In truth, it was the beginning of a slaughter. The march began under a merciless sun. Columns of prisoners stretched for miles along the dusty roads of central Luzon. They were ordered to keep moving, no stops, no rest. Anyone who lagged behind was beaten or shot. Japanese guards walked alongside, shouting, bayonets flashing. Civilians watched from the edges of villages, weeping in silence. Some risked their lives to pass fruit or coconuts through the lines. Many were killed for it. By the second day, the road was lined with bodies. Men collapsed from thirst and heat stroke. The living stepped over them. Those who reached for water in roadside ditches were struck down. Flies swarmed so thick that even the guards covered their faces. The air itself seemed to rot. One survivor later said, "Hell was a road in the Philippines, and we walked every mile of it." At night, there was no rest. Prisoners were herded into open fields, guarded by bayonets and rifles. Some tried to escape into the jungle. Few succeeded. The Japanese considered surrender dishonor, and they treated the captives as less than human. Men were beaten for sport, decapitated for amusement, or left to die without water. Others were forced to carry their own dead comrades. By the fifth day, delirium set in. Some prisoners walked in silence, eyes glazed, muttering to ghosts. Others sang hymns until their voices faded. When rain came, they lifted their faces to the sky, mouths open. It was the sweetest water they had ever tasted. Then the sun returned, and the road became an oven again. The march lasted over a week. Of the 76,000 who began, thousands died along the way. No one knows the true number. Perhaps 10,000, perhaps more. Their graves were the ditches, the dust, the silence that followed. When the survivors finally reached San Fernando, they were crammed into boxcars' metal coffins under the tropical sun. Men suffocated standing up, unable to move. When the doors opened hours later, the dead simply fell out onto the tracks. Those still alive stumbled onward to Camp O'Donnell, where the nightmare would continue. Inside those gates, history turned another page one, written in hunger, disease, and endurance beyond reason. Camp O'Donnell was not a camp at all. It was a field of mud surrounded by wire and guarded by fear. The barracks were nothing more than open-sided sheds, patched with palm leaves and tin. When the first groups of prisoners staggered through the gates, they were met not with water or rest, but with confusion. The Japanese had no food prepared, no medicine, no plan. The guards shouted orders that few understood. The prisoners collapsed where they stood. The air inside the camp was thick, heavy with the stench of sweat, dysentery, and rot. Flies clung to every surface. A single water spigot served thousands, its trickle guarded by bayonets. Men waited hours for a sip, often fainting before their turn came. Those who reached the spigot pressed cracked lips to the stream as if drinking from heaven itself. Disease swept through the huts faster than anyone could count. Malaria, beriberi, and pneumonia moved like invisible armies. Doctors among the captives tried to fight with what scraps they could find. They boiled bamboo for splints, ground charcoal into paste for wounds, and used shirts as bandages. They performed amputations with dull knives, whispering prayers as they cut. One medic wrote later that he had begun to measure success, not by lives saved, but by how gently he could help a man die. Every dawn began with roll call. The prisoners formed ragged lines as guards counted them over and over. Those who could not stand were dragged upright or beaten until they moved. The dead were carried to shallow graves beyond the fence, their dog tags collected in rusty tins. The living marched back to work hauling logs, repairing roads, digging trenches for an army that had destroyed them. The sun was relentless. Men's skin peeled and blistered. Their eyes sank deep into skulls. At night, the cold rain returned, chilling the fevered bodies to the bone. Hunger hollowed out minds as much as stomachs. Some dreamed aloud of food, describing dinners in Chicago or fiestas in Cebu. Others stared silently at nothing, lips moving without sound. Yet in that desolation, fragments of humanity survived. A guard once slipped a prisoner an extra spoon of rice. A Filipino farmer crept through the grass to throw a banana over the fence. A chaplain whispered mass with no bread, no wine, only words. The smallest gestures became acts of rebellion. By the second month, Camp O'Donnell was dying faster than it could bury its dead. The Japanese, alarmed by the stench of corpses, ordered the surviving Americans moved to a new site, Cabanatuan. The Filipinos, too many to count, were left behind. Within weeks, more than 20,000 of them would lie in the earth. The transfer to Cabanatuan was another march, shorter but no kinder. Men staggered through heat and mud, carrying their sick comrades on makeshift stretchers. Those who fell were left to the jungle. When they reached the new camp, they found the same barbed wire, the same fear, only more space to suffer. Cabanatuan became a world of routine misery. The days blurred together work details, roll calls, funerals. Prisoners built crude latrines, scrounged for edible weeds, and whispered news from the outside world. Rumors traveled faster than truth. MacArthur had landed in Australia. The Americans were coming back. The war would be over by Christmas. Each story kindled hope and then left behind a deeper ache when the weeks passed unchanged. Among the men were those who refused to surrender their sense of order. They drilled when they could, polished imaginary rifles, and held makeshift classes. One officer lectured about mathematics on the dirt floor, drawing equations with a stick. Another taught languages. The mind became a refuge when the body had nothing left. In the hospital huts, death was constant. The doctors learned to identify its approach. The glaze of the eyes, the slow breathing, the quiet smile of resignation, they called it the Bataan look. A man with that expression was already halfway gone. They buried him within hours to keep disease from spreading, marking the grave with bamboo and a number scrawled in charcoal. Through it all, the prisoners created rituals of remembrance. On the anniversary of the surrender, they gathered secretly to salute the flag that no longer flew. A scrap of red cloth, a blue strip torn from a shirt, a star carved into wood, together they made a symbol of the nation that had not abandoned them, even if it felt like it had. When the rainy season came, floods washed through the huts, carrying away what little comfort the men possessed. The guards shouted and laughed, herding the prisoners to higher ground. One night, lightning struck a nearby tree, igniting it in a column of white fire. For a moment the camp was illuminated, hundreds of skeletal figures standing motionless in the rain, staring at the burning tree as if it were a sign. Then darkness returned, and the thunder rolled away. In 1943, the rhythm of death began to slow. The strongest had adapted, the weakest were gone. The Japanese started sending groups of prisoners to labor camps in Manila, on Formosa, and even in Japan itself. Those chosen were packed into the infamous hell ships, dark holds where air was scarce and water scarcer. Many never reached their destinations. The sea, indifferent and vast, claimed them. Those left behind in Cabanatuan learned patience beyond measure. They cultivated small gardens behind the barracks, growing sweet potatoes and papayas from seeds smuggled in by sympathetic Filipinos. They carved chess pieces from wood, made playing cards from scraps of paper. Anything to remind themselves they were still alive, still capable of creating. Occasionally, kindness came from the unlikeliest sources. A Japanese medical orderly once slipped a sick prisoner a packet of sulfur powder. Another pretended not to notice a group of men stealing rice. War twisted everyone, even the captors. Some guards had once been farmers or students. Now they beat men who reminded them of the people they used to be. In whispers at night, the prisoners spoke of revenge. Not out of hatred, but out of a desperate need for meaning. When MacArthur comes back, they said, we'll make it right. The phrase became a prayer. They etched it into bamboo, scratched it onto the walls of their huts. I shall return. By late 1943, strange sounds began drifting across the night sky. The distant hum of engines, faint but real. American planes were flying somewhere far away. The guards grew tense. They forced the prisoners to dig new trenches, to build air raid shelters. The men obeyed silently, hearts pounding with hope. When the first American bomb fell on Japanese positions in the Philippines, the prisoners of Cabanatuan felt the ground tremble and cheered under their breath. It was not their camp being bombed, but it was close enough to taste freedom. For the first time in years, they dared to believe that their suffering might have an end. They did not know it yet, but history was turning. The tide that had swept them into captivity was beginning to recede. Beyond the wire, across the vast Pacific, ships were moving, armies were gathering, and a promise once made in despair was about to be kept. The prisoners of Bataan had become ghosts of their former selves. Yet inside those hollow eyes burned a stubborn light, the same light that had refused to die on the dusty roads of the march. They had been forgotten by the world, but not by fate. The winds were shifting, and deliverance was on its way. By the beginning of 1945, the thunder that had once echoed faintly beyond the hills of Luzon was now constant. The prisoners at Cabanatuan could see flashes of artillery on the horizon, could hear the slow, rhythmic growl of engines. Rumors moved faster than bullets. The Americans had landed on Leyte, the Japanese were falling back. General MacArthur had returned. Hope dangerous, fragile hope spread through the camp like fever. The guards felt it too. They barked orders more harshly, beat men for imagined infractions, and began digging trenches behind the fences. Everyone knew what those trenches meant. The Japanese High Command had issued secret instructions. If Allied forces approached, all prisoners were to be executed. The men of Cabanatuan slept with that knowledge pressing on their chests. They prayed not for rescue, but for swiftness if death came first. Then, in the late evening of January 30th, 1945, the jungle moved. Shadows slid across the paddies, low and silent. They were American Rangers' elite soldiers who had crossed miles of enemy territory, guided by Filipino guerrillas who knew every field and creek. At precisely 7:45 p.m., they struck. The first shots were muffled bursts. Searchlights cut through the dark. Shouting filled the camp. Prisoners woke in panic. Some thought it was another execution. Others fell to their knees in prayer. But through the chaos came voices in English, hoarse and desperate. "Get down! We're Americans! We're here!" For men who had forgotten the sound of their own language, the words were unbelievable. Some laughed, some cried, some simply stared. Within minutes the guards were overwhelmed. The Rangers poured through the wire, firing into watchtowers, tossing grenades into bunkers. The prisoners crawled, limped, stumbled toward the open gates. A few could not move at all, so the rangers carried them over shoulders, on makeshift stretchers any way possible. Outside the camp, the rescue column threaded through rice paddies under tracer fire. Japanese reinforcements were closing in from nearby towns. Bullets snapped through the grass. The rescuers and their charges kept moving, dragging each other through mud and water until their legs gave way. By dawn, they had reached friendly lines. Of the more than 500 prisoners held in Cabanatuan, all but 2 were alive. For the survivors, liberation was not joy. It was disbelief. They were too weak to feel anything but exhaustion. They slept for days in silence, guarded now by men who saluted them. Reporters later wrote that they looked like skeletons draped in rags. When photographs of their faces reached the United States, the public finally saw the reality of Bataan. What had once been rumor became undeniable fact. While medics fed broth to the rescued men, MacArthur's forces continued their push north. Manila erupted in flames. Japanese resistance was desperate and fanatical, but the outcome was never in doubt. On February 3, 1945, American troops liberated the city's main prison, freeing thousands more captives. A few weeks later, the first surviving defenders of Bataan stood on Philippine soil as free men again. The general himself arrived soon after, wading through the surf with cameras clicking. His words, "People of the Philippines, I have returned," were carried by radio around the world. To the survivors listening from hospital beds, they were not triumphal but personal. The promise that had kept them alive in darkness had been kept. Yet freedom did not erase the scars. Many of the rescued men weighed less than 90 pounds. Some were blind from malnutrition, others could no longer walk. They were shipped to hospitals in Leyte, then to Australia, then home. Nurses wept when they saw them. The smell of antiseptic replaced that of decay, but the memories clung like shadow. They had lived too long in a world where time measured itself by suffering. In the months that followed, Allied investigators gathered testimony about the march and the camps. The stories were consistent: starvation, beatings, executions, indifference. There was no exaggeration, only the dull precision of men who had seen too much to invent anything. Each affidavit added another brick to a monument of horror that the world would one day call war crimes. General Masaharu Homma, once the proud commander of the Japanese 14th Army, was captured in September 1945. His trial in Manila became a reckoning not only for him, but for an entire ideology that had equated surrender with shame. Witness after witness described the march, the camps, the unburied dead. Homma claimed ignorance. He said his subordinates had acted without orders. The tribunal listened, weighed, and condemned. On April 3, 1946, he faced a firing squad. Justice was delivered not with hatred, but with the cold precision of law. For many survivors, the verdict brought no relief. They had not wanted revenge, only acknowledgement. Some attended the trial, most stayed away. They preferred to leave judgment to history. "You cannot hate forever," one wrote in his diary. "Hatred eats the one who carries it." The Philippines emerged from the war scarred but unbroken. The jungles swallowed the wreckage of tanks and guns. The villages rebuilt. Filipinos and Americans together raised memorials to the dead. On Mount Samat, engineers erected a massive white cross that rose above the peninsula like a sentinel. From its base, one could see the shimmering waters of Manila Bay, the same sea where so many had once hoped to see the silhouettes of rescue ships. Each April 9th, survivors and their families gathered there. They climbed the hill slowly, placing wreaths at the foot of the cross. The wind off the bay carried their voices' soft prayers in English and Tagalog mingling in the air. Some were veterans who still wore faded uniforms. Others were children and grandchildren who had never known the war except through stories. Together they kept memory alive. In the United States, the men of Bataan returned quietly. They married, worked, raised families. Most rarely spoke of what had happened. When asked, they shrugged or changed the subject. A few wrote memoirs. "Give us this day," "My Hitch in Hell," "Ghost Soldiers," each a fragment of a vast and painful mosaic. Their words taught later generations that courage is not only the act of fighting, but of enduring. By the 1950s, the world was changing again. The Cold War had begun. New battles, new fears filled the headlines. Yet for the men who had walked from Mariveles to San Fernando, the old road never ended. They still woke in the night, tasting dust, hearing footsteps. Wives learned to wake them gently. Children grew up wondering why their fathers stared so long at nothing. Time did what armies could not. It softened the edges. Japanese and American veterans eventually met, shook hands, and wept together. Younger generations turned the battlefield into a classroom, the tragedy into lesson. The cruelty of the past was not forgotten, but it no longer ruled the future. Out of pain came understanding, a fragile, necessary peace. The legacy of Bataan became more than history. It became a mirror. It showed what men are capable of, both the monstrous and the magnificent. It taught that strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. It proved that even when the body breaks, the spirit can endure beyond imagination. In the twilight of their lives, the survivors gathered one last time beneath the great cross on Mount Samat. Their hair was white, their hands unsteady, but their eyes still sharp. They stood together in silence as a bugle played taps. The notes drifted down the slopes, mingling with the rustle of palms. A few saluted, others bowed their heads. Behind them, the sun sank into Manila Bay, the same red glow that had once lit a battlefield. Now it was peace. No one alive today remembers every name of those who walked the march. But their story endures in the earth itself, in the roads they trod, in the wind that whispers through the bamboo. The jungle has reclaimed much, yet even the vines seem to bend in reverence. History has folded their suffering into the larger tragedy of war. But Bataan remains singular, a symbol of how far endurance can stretch before breaking, and how even broken things can shine. To speak of Bataan is to speak of the human condition. It is the story of men who lost everything except the choice to remain human. They did not win their battle, yet they triumphed over despair. They proved that surrender is not always defeat, and that memory, carried with honesty, can outlast empires. And so the story continues. Each generation retells it, not for glory, but for understanding. The Death March, the camps, the liberation. They are chapters in a single truth, that courage is not born from victory, but from endurance. The men of Bataan endured. They still march in memory, step by step, through history's longest road. In the years that followed the gun's silence, the world discovered that peace can also wound. The survivors of Bataan returned to countries that were eager to move forward, to celebrate victory and forget defeat. Yet the men who had walked the march carried the past in their bones. They wore long sleeves to hide scars, kept food in their pockets long after they no longer needed to, and flinched at sudden noise. Their wives learned to leave an extra plate on the table, because hunger had become a memory that never left the room. For decades, few spoke openly. The word Bataan remained a private language between those who had been there. At veterans' halls and small-town parades, they met quietly, shaking hands without words. When they did talk, they spoke in fragments, snatches of road, flashes of light, the smell of rain on dust. Some could not finish their stories, others never began. Silence was easier than explanation, but history is patient. By the 1960s, a new generation of historians and journalists began searching the archives. They found diaries written in pencil on scraps of paper, photographs taken in secret, letters never mailed. From these fragments, the story of Bataan emerged again, this time as warning as well as tribute. School children read about the march. Museums displayed rusted dog tags, faded flags, and hand-carved rosaries made from coconut shell. Memory became a form of duty. In Manila, survivors from the Philippines formed associations dedicated to preserving the truth. They raised funds to restore the route of the march, planting markers at every 10 kilometers. Pilgrims walked the same road once a year, not to suffer, but to remember. The heat still shimmered on the asphalt, but now it bore the footprints of students, soldiers, and families carrying flowers instead of rifles. Along the way, locals offered water to the marchers, a gesture of mercy denied to their grandfathers. In the United States, recognition came slowly but steadily. Congress issued medals, presidents offered words. The men of Bataan were finally called what they had always been, defenders of freedom. Yet no ceremony could balance the ledger of pain. Many of the survivors had died before the nation learned their names. Their widows accepted medals with trembling hands, their faces lined by decades of waiting. The friendship between America and the Philippines deepened through remembrance. Joint memorials rose along the coastlines and in the hills. At Mount Samat, the great white cross gleamed under a sun once witness to war. Beneath it, the bones of the fallen rested in peace. Each year, diplomats, veterans, and children stood together beneath its shadow, while the Philippine Army Band played both national anthems. The two flags moved in the wind as if saluting one another. For Japan, the memory of Bataan was a wound of conscience. In the decades after the war, Japanese historians unearthed forgotten reports and diaries that described the march. They found entries written by soldiers who had felt shame but obeyed orders. In small villages across Japan, memorial stones were raised not in pride but in repentance. Former soldiers sent letters of apology to families of the dead. Some traveled to the Philippines to bow before the graves. Forgiveness, when it came, was quiet but real. The story of Bataan gradually entered classrooms, universities, and films. Documentaries told the tale in calm, steady voices. Actors reenacted the march with faces streaked in dust. Yet the truest record remained the testimonies of the men themselves. When asked why they survived, most answered simply, "Because someone beside me did not." Survival for them was inheritance. To live was to carry another man's memory forward. By the late 20th century, only a handful of veterans remained. They gathered less often, their numbers thinning each year. When they spoke to students, their voices trembled, but their eyes were steady. They did not speak of hatred. They spoke of endurance, of faith, of how quickly civilization can vanish and how difficult it is to rebuild. They told the young to guard humanity more fiercely than territory. As the 21st century began, technology gave new life to remembrance. Digital archives preserved diaries. Virtual tours traced the route of the march. Scholars cross-referenced names long lost to clerical chaos, restoring identity to thousands of forgotten graves. The Internet, a tool of the future, became the keeper of the past. The men who had once dreamed of letters reaching home now had their stories read across the world. Every April 9th, at dawn, a bugle still sounds at Mount Samat. The notes drift down the hills to the sea, echoing off the water. Survivors' descendants stand in silence. Some are soldiers themselves, others teachers, engineers, farmers, but all share the same quiet pride. They know that history's weight is lighter when carried together. Across the Pacific, in small towns of America, candles are lit in windows. The names of the fallen are read aloud in community centers and schools. Young voices pronounce them carefully, as if tasting foreign syllables for the first time. In that act, the dead speak again. Each name is a reminder that freedom, once purchased at such a cost, can never be taken for granted. Historians still argue over strategy, whether Bataan was inevitable, whether better planning might have changed its fate. But those debates fade beside the human story. For the men who fought there, history was not theory. It was hunger, pain, and the stubborn refusal to surrender the self. Their endurance was a kind of victory that statistics cannot measure. In the quiet of modern Manila, the old battlefields have been overtaken by highways and houses. Children play where trenches once ran. The sea glitters where ships burned. Yet sometimes, in the stillness before dusk, locals swear they can hear distant marching, the echo of boots on forgotten roads, the rhythm of hearts that refuse to stop. It is imagination, perhaps, but imagination is how memory breathes. The story of Bataan does not belong to one nation. It belongs to anyone who has faced the edge of despair and chosen to endure. It is a map of the human spirit drawn in pain but pointing toward hope. Every generation finds itself somewhere on that map, standing, walking, surviving. What remains after all the years is a lesson too simple to forget. That courage is not loud and heroism is not clean. It is the dirty, hungry, trembling will to keep moving forward when the world says stop. The men of Bataan taught that lesson in every step of their march. When the last veteran died, a journalist asked his grandson what the old man had wanted people to remember. The grandson answered quietly that he was one of many. That was the heart of Bataan, not one hero, but thousands of ordinary men who together made endurance sacred. Now the sun sets each day over a peaceful bay. The cross on Mount Samat catches the last light and glows gold against the sky. Beneath it lie the bones of strangers who became brothers. Their story travels still, carried by the wind and by the voices of those who tell it. And as long as it is told, Bataan will never fall again.